The best controllers you've never used, and we're not talking about your old schoolyard cohort Timmy's N64 controller that he would always hog in favor of the Mad Catz special just for you. We're talking about controllers that years later, after all the dust has settled, you've still never used because maybe they're hard to find, expensive, maybe you decided against them, or the ever popular reason of you just didn't know about it for some reason. And by the way, Timmy's a lot better at sharing these days, aren't you, Timmy? For this video, I'm going to be covering 5 different controllers that I would bet most people have never used. At the very least, due to the unique blend of randomness with a splash of obscurity that went into my choices, I'd be surprised if anybody watching has all 5 of them. And if you do, well, you've earned yourself a "how about that" reaction from me. Now, while some of the controllers I'll be mentioning could be considered obscure, the goal isn't to try to show you controllers that are just obscure. They have to be good controllers that just so happen to be more on the obscure side than your tried and true slightly yellowed NES pad. So you won't be seeing the Intel Wireless Series controller here because it's not good. Also, I should probably put the disclaimer out there that you won't be seeing the Mega Jockey 9000 because I've never used one. However, I can imagine. But with that, let's start with the first controller, which would be the Hori GameCube controller. Famous for its resemblance to a Super Nintendo controller, and its intention to be used with the GameCube's Game Boy player to play Game Boy Advance games, a system often compared to the Super Nintendo. It's certainly a concept that crosses a lot of T's and dots a lot of I's, but what's not quite as palatable is how limited their distribution was, making them a son of a barnacle to get your hands on today. Don't believe me? Go locate your nearest barnacle bunch and try to tell me which one is a son of who. You probably don't know. I should mention, though, that there are some replicas of these controllers that I've heard good things about. This controller is most likely going to be for fans of the Game Boy player. After all, the GameCube didn't really have many games that even used the D-pad. I like using a D-pad with Ikaruga personally, but other than that, I find the D-pad mostly comes in handy for playing Game Boy games. Pretty common desire. I mean, people love the GameCube's Game Boy player, and let's just hope we don't see its startup disc getting encased and graded. But when going to play Game Boy games on the GameCube, many people think, hey, wait a minute, I have to play using the GameCube stock D-pad? This makes me mad. Come on, using the Game Boy Advance's D-pad was good. How am I supposed to use literally the exact same D-pad? And if it's not the exact same, it sure is pretty darn close. I feel like people don't realize this. In any case, a bigger D-pad is nicer, and that's where this controller comes in handy. It more or less feels like a Super Nintendo controller, one of the most loved retro controllers out there. The main difference I've noticed, other than the buttons, is that it has more of a grippy part on the bottom, making it feel even more ergonomic in your hands. A nice little bonus in the battle against carpal tunnel, and one more thing you can let your mom know about to ensure you're taking care of yourself. Now, if you're a fan of Hori making controllers inspired for use with Nintendo's Game Boy players, believe it or not, we're not done yet. Before the GameCube's Game Boy player, there was Ape Escape for the PlayStation, irrelevant to this topic, but just figured I'd sneak it in there. But before the GameCube's Game Boy player, there was also the Super Game Boy, and with the Super Game Boy, there was the SGB Commander, an ode to the original Game Boy in many ways. Only problem is that you can't fit 4 AA batteries into it, which made the original Game Boy such a threat if swung around. Just ask the side of my friend's little brother's head. But don't you worry, I cooked up a solution. Now you're playing with power. Anywho, when it comes to playing games with it, it delivers all the quality you'd expect from Hori. Besides being, kinda cute in its design cues taken from the Game Boy, it's a darn good controller. The D-pad is great, the buttons feel nice, but my favorite thing about it is the fact that the buttons are labeled to let you quickly identify what does what in terms of the different Super Game Boy features. Because what kind of priority is it for me to memorize what does what without labels? Not much of one. You can also switch the controller into Super Nintendo mode, or Super Famicom if that's more your lingo. And I find having face buttons for L and R works better for games like Street Fighter. So you could use this controller to play Super Nintendo games as well. Naturally, some of you might say, why not just use the Super Nintendo controller since that's already a really good controller? To which I'd say, yeah, that's a good point. Remember, I'm not saying any of these controllers are controllers that you have to have or should replace what you already have. I wouldn't dare say old reliable ain't reliable no more. These are just really good controllers that most people have probably never used. To which I'd say this controller fits that description well. And that leads to the next controller on my list, the Sega Control Pad for PS2. This is basically a Sega Saturn controller for PS2, which conveniently also works on the PS1, which has a ton of great 2D games that could really benefit from the use of the Saturn's excellent D-pad. Such as Raiden. You might be wondering what's going on here. I never said I wasn't a dirty dog, now did I? I'm playing in a rotated Tate mode here in order to get the game's full resolution. Now, some people might say that they've already used this if they've used a Saturn controller before. Well, you haven't used one that has a select button, now have ya? And I'm telling you, it's pretty nice. But what I actually wanted to say is that even just a standard Saturn controller is something a lot of people have never used before, and it's way too good of a controller for that to be the case. This thing is a beauty, and I personally think it deserves all the hype it gets. And because more people own a PlayStation 1 than Sega Saturn, I thought this would be a fun controller to bring up. But while we're talking about Sega Saturn, the next controller on my list is the Virtua Twin Stick. Now, I know what you might be thinking right now. Did I forget to turn one of the burners off on my stove? You probably didn't, but just go check real quick for peace of mind. You might also be thinking, what is the big deal with this controller? There's all kinds of controllers designed to replicate the arcade experience. That's true, and I've used a lot of them over the years, but none have felt as authentic as this one. Helping this controller out is the fact that it uses what feel like real micro switches, aka real arcade parts. A lot of times these made-for-home things, especially for 90s consoles, would have some sort of cheaper, sometimes plasticky garbage alternative parts on the inside. But not here, this feels like the real deal. The buttons feel good too. Sure, most people would basically only use this to play virtual on, but remember, the bar set for bringing the arcade experience home by some folks is whatever it takes. So, having this ain't so bad by comparison. Plus, this game is a lot of fun with the high skill ceiling. Seriously, this game will destroy you. Alright, but while we're talking about the arcade experience at home, my next suggestion isn't actually a specific controller, but just arcade sticks in general. This one I have here has a custom art insert. These suckers use real arcade parts and are a huge step up from a lot of the made-for-home arcade sticks you'd see back in the day. Utilizing real arcade buttons, typically these come with Japanese buttons that are softer to the touch, but if you really want to, you can put some of the US or Euro style buttons in there to give you that super clicky, smashing the heck out of it feel you may be used to from your childhood. Now that's bringing back the kind of nostalgia I'm talking about. Typically, these arcade sticks are going to be more likely options for more modern consoles, specifically the Xbox 360 and newer, and to give people even more pause, these arcade sticks are often designed for a single console, so What, you're supposed to just buy a new one for each console? What do they think we are, maniacs? Well, they might actually be right about that, but luckily there's a wide assortment of various adapters to let you use them on different consoles. Plus, many of these work on computers, and I'll just let your imagination take over from there. There's even an adapter that lets you use them on a Sega Saturn and Sega Dreamcast. Believe me, playing Dreamcast arcade games with this instead of this is a huge upgrade. Keep in mind that playing on an arcade stick won't necessarily make you better at the games you're playing right away, or possibly ever. Learning to use an arcade stick to do, let's just say, fighting combo motions feels different than performing them on a D-pad. You're using different muscles, and therefore it's a different muscle memory you'll need to establish, and nope, that won't help you. That said, it can be learned, and playing arcade games with an arcade stick is just, well, really fun, and most people don't bother to own these things. My suggestion is to pick up a used one. These things are designed to withstand a lot of abuse, and so odds are it'll still work just fine. Plus, you can replace the parts inside for fairly cheap, and it's usually simple to do so. Alright, and there we go for the 5 controllers I wanted to bring up. How many of the 5 do you already own, and how many of the 5 piqued your interest? I'd be curious to know. Oh, and for the love of Jiminy Cricket, please don't say I'm trying to show off these controllers. I really don't care if anyone is impressed or not, I just need to be able to show what I'm talking about. So, as always, share your thoughts down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games.